So who brought their tactics book? Anybody? So last week, what did we talk about? Who was here last week? Alan was here. You were here. What did we talk about last week?
Tactics.
Very good. So today, we touched on the idea of the Columbo tactic, that you can ask leading questions, and questions are the best way to get people to open up about what they truly believe about their worldview, because it's not necessarily on you to be in the driver's seat to where you have to know all the answers and you have to drive the entire conversation. You can make it to where you ask them and ask them what they believe and then lead it from there. So the second half of the book is on a larger topic, self-destructing arguments. There's a lot of subtopics in this. I personally think it's the most powerful logical tool in the universe. I'd say it's the most powerful apologetics tool you could have. I know a lot of apologists say if you know one thing well with clear thinking, it's avoiding self-destructing arguments. It's a pretty fantastic picture. I found it on stock photos. He did.
That's your dad?
No, but he actually did cut off. So that's moral of the story. Thanks for that story, babe. So the first subtitle of self-refuting arguments is ones that are necessarily false. So there's no condition where they could be true. Self-refuting statements are necessarily false. There's no conditions. They can be true. Contradictory statements cannot both be true at the same time. And you can use really obvious examples. I always say, my brother's an only child, or I can't speak a word in English. And those are clearly, explicitly false. You always ask the question, what happens when this claim is applied to itself? Many of these examples are explicit, but when you're talking to people with apologetics, 80% of them are very implicit. And unless you have practiced and you learn the certain things that happen in the pattern, it's kind of hard to notice it without practice. So we are going to practice. So on the left are some self-refuting statements, and this is going to be an interactive assignment. So if somebody says to you, there is no truth, / no one has the truth, you would say, is that statement true? Right? It's pretty obvious. There are no absolutes. All truth is relative. Is that an absolute? If not, then why should we listen to your opinion? If you're saying something is absolutely not absolute, you can immediately ask, is that statement an absolute? I went too far. No one can know any truth about religion. How did you come to that truth about religion? You can't know anything for sure. How did you know that for sure? A lot of these are pretty, like you can just look at the claim and immediately apply it to itself. You always think, when I see a claim like this, and it's hard because a lot of times they're chained together or it's part of a larger argument. People are putting a lot of assertions together and they just throw one of these in there and it sounds really good. It sounds like they're on the moral high ground because they say, well, you should never, nothing's ever black and white. You should never judge anybody. And it almost makes them sound like they are in a superior position with where they're arguing from. You can only know truth through experience. It's an interesting one. What specific experience taught you this truth? Nothing's ever black and white, except the statement, of course. You should never force your morals on someone else. What do you think about this one?
Why are you forcing your morals?
Why is it okay to force this moral view upon me? Why are you telling me how to live? You must doubt everything, including this statement. Everyone's view is a product of their own bias and prejudices. Has anyone ever heard this statement in a debate about religion? Right? And they say, well, you only believe this because you were brought up this way in this culture, and you have this specific bias, and therefore, why would you trust anything that you think? But you can immediately ask, if you ever say everyone's view is a product of their own bias and prejudices, including this view, is this view biased and prejudiced? A lot of these have the self-exemption fallacy. They say, everyone except me, everyone else's view is biased except mine, because you would never hold a view that you know is clearly untrue. You only believe true things. It sounds pretty trivial, but no one believes that their view is biased. You shouldn't try to convert people. Thoughts? Why are you converting me to believe that I should not convert anybody? God doesn't take sides. I've actually run into this one before. This one's kind of interesting. If somebody says to you, well, God doesn't take sides. You can't be black and white. But this statement implies that God is taking a side, and the side is that he does not take any sides. Does God take that side? Because God all of a sudden is following what you have said he does. Now, something that's interesting that is really helpful to me, is there anything you notice in a pattern in all of these statements? There's something that is, other than being self-refuting, there's something that they all have in common in a fairly broad sense.
It's always using like words like always or every or...
So as some kind of definite article, it says, you can only know this. You can always. You can't ever know anything for sure. A really good rule of thumb is when everybody says there is like, you must doubt everything, or you can't believe anything, or no one has the truth. You should immediately think, is this statement self-refuting? Because one of the biggest things, like Greg Kokel talks about in Tactics, is you can save yourself so much heartache because these statements are necessarily false. There's no condition where they can be true, so no argument can be built off of them. It's like saying, like it's just as good as like saying random gibberish, like you haven't really said anything. Now the problem is, a lot of them are implicit fallacies, or I'd say there's degrees of it. But somebody comes to you and says, men wrote the Bible, and men of course are imperfect, therefore the Bible is flawed. Another version of this is humans fall victim to hallucinations. You know what happens, right? Therefore the disciples must have hallucinated the events in the Bible, including the resurrection. What are they exempting themselves from? It's a good thing to think about.
Well, I think there's two parts to that statement. I think one is, if you're going to say men wrote the Bible, then that means you can't believe any part of history, right? Because men write history. The second part, for the hallucinations, if you look into the hallucinations only, everyone has, like if I'm going to have an hallucination, I'm going to be the only one seeing that hallucination. You don't see hallucinations in a group of people. We're not all going to see the same hallucination.
Yeah.
So
That's great, and that's really what it's getting at. So it's saying men wrote the Bible, but it's self-exemption. You are also in that category. You're not outside of that category. So you say, why do you exempt yourself from this? You do not think that you have made a flaw in this judgment. It does not follow that because people are capable of error that they always will be in error. It's the idea that, well, we know that humans can hallucinate, therefore it follows that the disciples must have hallucinated the events. Or we know that humans are fallible creatures, therefore the Bible must be flawed. It's exempting yourself. You say, well, you believe this judgment to be true, but you are a human and you are capable of error. If you can't even give them the benefit of the doubt, it's like we had this discussion a couple semesters ago where somebody brought it up here and they said the disciples must have hallucinated. And Matt Graham said, well, why would you give yourself the benefit of the doubt that you know when you're not hallucinating, but you wouldn't give the disciples the benefit of the doubt? Only science can give us reliable truth. Anyone want to take a stab at that?
Science can't prove that statement.
Very good. He's heard that one before. This statement itself is not self-scientific and thus cannot be proven by science. This statement relies on philosophy and rationality, which is outside of science. This one's very implicit because we kind of tend to think, well, come on, touch on this topic later, but science has taken on this deity in and of itself. It's such a powerful tool that we automatically assume that it can be applied in every circumstance. All religions are equally true. Sean?
That also means that all religions are equally false. So it's a self-destructive statement.
Well, it means, if all religions are equally true, then Christianity is true, but Christianity is exclusive. Then Hinduism is true, and Hinduism is exclusive. The problem, interestingly enough, is not whether you go to heaven or reincarnate or turn to dust, but you can't do all of them at the same time. If religions make specific claims and they say, you will go to be in the presence of God, or you will be reincarnated, nowhere else in the universe, really, do we have this view of such high relativistic views, because you say, well, they must all be equally true. But if you look at every single main world religion, they are all exclusive in their truth claims. All truth relies on your perspective. Yeah, this one's a little tricky. This is an objective statement that claims relativism is true. It commits the self-accepting fallacy. Does this truth rely on your perspective? Or is that an absolute truth? It's the same thing. It's like, does that truth that you just said rely on your specific perspective, or does it stand on its own? History is unknowable. This gets back to what Jared was talking about. Like, you know, back in ancient history, of course, we can't know what they really meant. You say, well, even comprehending the statement implies that things from the past can be known in the present. Jim, it does not follow necessarily that to say history is unknowable is in itself a self-refuting fallacy, because you would have to have some understanding of history to have that. The only truth you can rely on is what you can perceive with your physical senses. This is a good one. It kind of follows along with this, only science can give reliable truth. Sean?
I can't feel gravity, but I know it's real.
You did not use your physical senses to deduce this statement, nor can it be proven by them. It's the idea that with this and only science gives us reliable truth, there are a much broader sense of self-refuting statements. It's very easy to see, oh, I can't speak a word in English is self-refuting, or this statement is false, something like that. Just to catch you up, Jim, we were going over implicit versus explicit. So some of these were like, there is no truth, is this statement true? But it's part of the broader idea of self-refuting arguments. Which one of these, or any of these, would you guys feel like if somebody said this to you, any of these statements, you'd be a little bit thrown off? Like on the face of it, you'd be like, wow, that actually sounds really good, right? Because somebody comes to you and says, you know, science is reliable, and it's been proven, it's gotten us to the moon, it's gotten us vaccines, it's curing cancer. Everything outside of science is just relative opinion. There's really no way to like instantiate it and tell like whether it's true. Really, only science can give us absolute definite proof. I've like brought like other words into it, but I've really said the exact same thing. And that's one of the hard things is you can have a self-refuting statement that's an entire paragraph or multiple sentences. But it's really hard because you have to step back and think, what did they just say and what is the point that they're trying to make? Because they can add, like with all religions are equally true, they could add a whole life story in there about Hinduism and then talk about Christianity and then end with the statement, all religions are equally true. Therefore, you could never make any value judgments about any of the religions. You could ask them why they're making that value judgment or why you're making this statement. I think it's easy to see them in this sense, but I think it's very hard. I think it takes a lot of practice to see them when you're in conversation. And I think it's something we can definitely like practice, or if you're ever in a discussion with somebody, it's almost guaranteed that at some point they are going to bring up something that is in some category self-refuting. Now, if you remember, all of these are necessarily false. There's no condition. It's much easier to see with the explicit fallacies, but there's no conditions where they can be true. So it's very good to know. The other little side note to this is practical suicide, and this kind of ties into where self-refuting statements can be reworded to not be inherently self-refuting until they are acted upon or voiced. So it's kind of tricky because to say it is wrong to say that people are wrong is not inherently self-refuting, but it is when you say it to somebody because you're saying it in a you ought not to do this sense. Like it's an action you're expecting them to do. So it becomes self-refuting once you put it into practice. And you find a lot of these statements are kind of dressed up that way, and they're not self-refuting they're not clearly self-refuting in the absolute, like you can see it in this sense, and you're like, oh, that's very obvious. A lot of them only when they're like acted upon. And the problem is, a lot of people don't necessarily, it's like they believe a worldview, or they believe the statement, but they have to exempt themselves from it. Because in order to say it is wrong to say that people are wrong, you must believe that you are right and everyone else is wrong about this. Does that make sense? The interesting question, though, is what statements can you stand upon? And this is the most powerful side of it. Because if you think about it, what do especially the explicit statements, think about the other side to this. If someone says to you, there is no truth, and you say, is this statement true? This statement is necessarily false. But what does that mean? What's the other side of that? That there is truth. So there is truth. There are absolutes, and there are absolute truths. You can know truth about religion. You can know things for sure. You can know things outside of necessarily your personal experience. There are some things that are black and white that are absolute. It's okay to if someone is incorrect, it's not force is the wrong word, like the wrong verb in this sense, but to inform someone that may have an incorrect view is not wrong because there, as we know from above, there are correct views and there are incorrect views. You don't have to doubt everything. You can know things for sure. This is one of the favorite things that people say is, well, you should doubt everything about religion. You never know anything for sure. And remember when, what's this? He's like, you never can come to any conclusions about anything. Josh was like, to a friend of ours, and he's like, what about that one? And he's like, what? Hey, he was an interesting dude. Not all of your views are a product of your own bias and prejudices. You should try and convert people, not necessarily religiously, but if they believe something that's false, they owe it to themselves to know what is true if they're a rational person. And I guess God would take a side, and the side would be truth, or what his nature is. But I think there's a lot of freedom in this. When we look at these, especially science can give us reliable truth, there are truths that are outside of the scientific realm. There are truths that you can only know through something else, whether that be philosophy, theology, personal experience. It's kind of an interesting thing because there could be very well supernatural truths that science itself, very firmly in the natural, could never tell you really anything about. Not all religions are equally true. Not all truth relies on your perspective. There are absolute truths, and history is knowable. And then there are truths that you can rely on that you can't necessarily perceive with your physical senses. So I just put this, the opposite of these. You should remember that. But I think it's much more freeing. To me, it's so liberating to think that it logically must follow that there is absolute truth, and it is knowable, and there are truths about religion that can be known, and you can know things for sure, and you can know things not necessarily through experience. It's very freeing because then that sets you on the journey where you are stable in your foundation because you always want to start somewhere. If you're starting from somewhere and you're like, I really don't know if there is any truth. I really don't know if there is any absolutes. I don't know if I can ever know anything about anything. It's this idea that not only is it illogical, but you're starting out at this place where you're not really going anywhere. You're never really going to discover anything because, well, if I discover something, I should always doubt that, and I should never be sure. And I know that there's no absolute truths, so then maybe everything's just relative to me, and it's like you get all wound up in your head. But if you think clearly and you start from a place that is logically sound, that is necessarily true, instead of necessarily false, it's just, to me, it's like the best starting place. Now, everything else in apologetics comes after this. You could say, okay, there are absolutes, and there is truth, and it's out there. So then it starts on the journey like our 4-point apologetic. Does truth exist? Truth exists, which is self-refuting to say it doesn't. Then does God exist? Because either he does or he doesn't. Right there, that sets you on a journey to see, well, how am I going to find out about this? One of the really interesting one is dependency-defeating arguments. He calls this infanticide, I think is how you pronounce it. But the idea is infanticide is when you kill a child, right? So a dependency-defeating argument, when statements refute the very thing they need in order to survive, like I do not have any vocal cords. Do you see how that follows? Like I am using vocal cords to say that I have no vocal cords. My father and mother never existed. But I need them in order to exist to say that they don't exist. So when you have something that your very identity as an object is dependent upon, like vocal cords being able to say you do not have any vocal cords, you run into this problem that's much harder to spot, where you are defeating the dependency upon which you rely to stand. It's like saying, could you go back in time and kill your own grandfather? Well, you go back in time and kill your own grandfather, and then your parents are never born, then you're never born, so how could you go back in time? It's that whole circular argument. You quickly get to the point where you realize that you need certain conditions to be true in order to make the statement wrongly that they're not true. This is what he says in the book. If a claim cannot be made unless the parent concept is true, yet the claim denies the parent concept, then the argument commits infanticide. One of the interesting, I know the problem of evil is you could spend weeks talking about it. It's probably the biggest topic. A good and loving God cannot exist with all the evil present in the world. You look at the Holocaust and you say a good and loving God would never allow that to happen. Now the question is, what do you mean by evil? Not examples of evil, evil itself. And the biggest trap that people fall into is when they talk to atheists, they say, you can't be good without God. And atheists say, well, I'm a moral person, I'm good. And the question is not, can you be good without God? The question is there good without God? Is there such a thing as good or evil? Not, am I a moral person? Do I do good things? But in its very definition, does it exist? You must first know what evil is before you can point to examples of it. There must be a standard, a scoring system to know when there are moral shortcomings. It's interesting that in any other realm, we are totally okay with knowing that there's a scoring system. You go and you play golf, and you're going against a scoring system. Right now, the Olympics are going on, and it's going against a scoring system. Now, with morals, to say that you are wrong, you are out of sorts, like you ought to not kill children, implies that you are violating and you have missed the mark. You cannot make the statement, you ought not to torture children for fun, unless torturing children for fun is wrong. But being wrong implies a standard. And the problem is, if I illustrate this, it's very, very hard to get a moral standard from an is. So the problem is, as theists, we look to God, the original mind, to our mind, and there are moral responsibilities in the universe, in the fabric of the universe that are immaterial, and everyone's born with a moral understanding. But if you go the opposite way from molecules, there's no link here. It's very, very hard to get an ought from an is. The is just the molecules. They just are. They just exist, just like this table exists, right? But it's very, very hard to get a moral obligation. In fact, no one has ever made this link. There's no link between having a moral obligation where Hitler was wrong for gassing the Jews from just collections of atoms. So it's one of the biggest things that atheists have to come to this conclusion. The biggest thing you can ask an atheist is, where do you get your moral system from? And a lot of them will say, well, I just believe that it's something we've come up with socially, and we've just averaged everything out, and it's for the good of everybody. But one of the interesting problems is, we don't live in an amoral universe. If we lived in an amoral universe, there would be no such thing as morals. And the best analogy I've ever had of this is that if we lived in a universe with no color, you would not know what color is. Because a lot of times when people argue about morals, they're arguing about the morality of something. They're not arguing about the existence of it. When somebody argues about the color of this book, they're not arguing about the existence of color. They're arguing about what color is it. So the idea is, if you think, it's kind of hard to think about because you can't picture something that you can't picture. But if the universe was completely amoral or completely colorless, you would not even be able to talk about what color something was because it simply does not exist. So if we live in a universe where we have some moral obligation and some moral sense, it raises this really sticky problem when you're like, how can I ever stand here and say that anything is morally wrong if there are no absolutes? There is no standard of scoring. A moral rule is a command. Commands are features of minds. A duty is something that is owed, but something can be owed only to some person or persons. There can be no such thing as a duty in isolation. A tree doesn't owe anything to another tree, if that makes sense. Like a mind can owe something to another mind. Like you come from the original mind, you would say, to our mind, and there is a sense of a standard, and you can be on either side of that standard, but you are judged by that. The concept of moral obligations is unintelligible apart from God. The word remains, but their meaning is gone. So it's a problem because you are using a topic from God to try to disprove God. But you need God to exist and have morality in order to even say that anything is wrong. So when an atheist says something is wrong, a lot of atheists are true about this. If an atheist ever says something's wrong and you correct them and say, you can't say that, all of them are like, yeah, actually I can't. And they take it back. Because no atheist, if they follow it to the final conclusion, could stand there and say anything is necessarily wrong. Because then you can ask them, why? And they would just have to go back and back and back and back and back. And eventually there's no position to stand on. My 2 rules of thumb that I think is interesting is, we'll get to this later. If you ever find yourself committing a self-defeating fallacy or saying that Hitler was right, you've probably gone wrong somewhere. Like if you ever get to the point where you try out somebody's worldview and you get to the point where they can't say that Hitler was wrong for gassing Jews, you may have made a wrong turn. Another example of infanticide is scientism. So scientism is everything outside of science is a matter of mere belief and subjective opinion and cannot be relied upon or rationally assessed. It's the idea I touched on earlier. Science is very, very powerful, and it's very, very easy to apply it everywhere and say, well, we know it works very well here, so therefore it must get all truth claims from these tools. I want to collect all knowledge in a box. Let's call this the truth box. Here's a picture of my truth box, right? I want to take all knowledge and put it in that box, right? Before any truth can go into the box, however, it must first pass scientific examination to see if it's true, right? The box project can never start because some truth must be in the box first before science itself could begin its analysis. The truths of logic, mathematics, the entire scientific method, the reliability of rationality and senses, the moral truth to report things honestly, etc., must be in the box to begin with. None of these truths can be validated by science because science itself relies upon them in their inherent reliability and truth value. The idea is science cannot operate in a vacuum and is only as strong as its presuppositions. So we look at this idea of science as a whole and we say this is incredibly powerful. But just like the self-refuting statements before, you are only as powerful as the things you rely upon. The question being, how could anybody know any scientific truths if you can't even trust your own rationality? If your rationality isn't in that box, and that's true, how would you know anything's true? It's kind of a convoluted way to say, you know, if you want to apply science to everything, you realize very quickly that that is self-refuting in its nature because science is relying upon these as its parent concepts, even the morality to know that you're reporting things honestly. Does that kind of make sense? All of these kind of overlap, and there's very few things that play into all three of them. But there's one very, very interesting concept. You have to remember that self-refuting arguments infect entire worldviews, not just statements. It's very easy to say, this statement is obviously self-refuting. It's just right there in your face. But you forget that a self-refuting argument can infect your entire philosophy on life. And the entire grounding that you have can be undermined. I want you to watch this video. It's like 2 minutes long. From everything we've talked about, I might pause it, but think, and then like 2 minutes and 40 seconds, he's asked a question. This was the final question on a live panel between Lawrence Krauss and Richard Dawkins. They, Sam Harris and Daniel Dennett, are the most famous neo-atheists, I would say, today. They call them the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse or whatever. But they are the most outspoken, most popular, highest amount of books sold, most well-published. They are very much on the popular stage. What's really interesting is that before now, it was very hard to get this statement out loud on tape. And it's kind of a new phenomenon when you hear what he says for someone to admit this. And it's becoming a new thing. You see, is there volume?
Yeah, it should be. But it's on the screen. Can you turn it up? Small one.
Is it working? Do you know how to get this work, Noah? You can just pull it up directly. How do you get them to work? I can just pull it up on Chrome. Hold on.
That might be the way to do it.
Where's...
beings? And if not, is there a biological evolutionary reason why all of us believe we have free will?
No. Okay, sorry. It's running now. Okay, so with everything we've talked about, pay attention. He makes a few very interesting statements during this.
Scientific basis for the concept of free will in human beings? And if not, is there a biological evolutionary reason why all of us believe we have free will?
The late Christopher Hitchens, when asked, does he believe in free will, replied, I have no choice. It's a question that I'd read, actually, because I don't have a very well thought out view about it. I think that, I mean, I have a materialist view of the world. I think that, that things are determined in a rational way by antecedent events. And so that commits me to the view that when I think I have free will, when I think that I'm exercising free choice, I'm deluding myself, that my brain states are determined by physical events. And yet that seems to contradict, to go against the very powerful subjective impression that we all have, that we do have free will. I think all I can do is recommend the works of my colleague Daniel Dennett on the subject, which are fascinating.
And there's a new book by another one of our colleagues, Sam Harris, on free will is coming out. But,
Yes.
but I also have to agree that I think everything I know about the world tells me that there's no such thing as free will. I just think we act, but we act, but the world behaves as if there's free will, and so it doesn't make much difference. Just like the particles in the room, we can discuss them statistically, and they behave as if they can do things that they're not being forced to do. It's just statistics. And we behave as if we have free will because we live in a very complex world where there's so many factors influencing any of our decisions that if you can't trace that free will down to its source. And so the difference between a world where we act as if we have free will or looks like we have free will and we really do, in my mind, is so minimal that it's a question for philosophers to worry about, but not me. And maybe with that, we'll thank you very much.
Real quick, just want to look at the very first things Richard Dawkins says. And Lawrence Krauss, in different words, basically says the exact same
Is there
thing.
any reason why all of us believe we have free will?
The late Christopher Hitchens, when asked, does he believe in free will, replied, I have no choice. It's a question that I dread, actually, because I don't have a very well thought out view about it. I think that, I mean, I have a materialist view of the world. I think that that things are determined in a rational way by antecedent events. And so that commits me to the view that when I think I have free will, when I think that I'm exercising free choice, I'm deluding myself, that my brain states are determined.
What was that last statement he said? My brain states are determined. So it's absolutely fascinating. Now remember from the beginning of the talk, if an idea can be proved necessarily false, it must be false. So it's a really interesting situation because this has been a very recent push where for a lot of years atheists were really not comfortable about this, but they finally taken the last step in their worldview. Richard Dawkins believes that he has a brain, we'll call it right here, this is his brain. He says, I have a materialist view. Everything is just materials, just molecules, just in different arrangements, different, more complicated arrangements. Everything that I believe is based on antecedent events, events that have come before. He talks about his brain states. And he says, when I believe I have free will, I am deluding myself. Lawrence Krauss says, everything I know about the world tells me there is no free will, right? This is a very interesting consequence because he believes that his brain is a series of frames of past brain states, theoretically all the way back to the point where as a fetus he first was able to have neurons and pass the electrical communications to have any kind of sensation, right? From then until now, or technically right now, every single state of his brain is dependent wholly upon previous brain states over which he has no control, right? He says he's a hard determinist, and that's what a hard determinist believes. Sam Harris, Lawrence Krauss, Daniel Dennett, they're all hard determinists. Now the problem with this is, if you believe that you have no rationality, you have no conscious mind or free will, you're not making any decisions, you're only reacting to things. There is no thinking involved. So the problem is it's like the idea of a leaf blowing around in the wind. It has the input of the wind and an output of blowing around, but it's not thinking, it just is. The consequence of this is that you have very complicated brain states, but all you are is just a combination of inputs and outputs. And in here, there is no thinking. There is no free will, remember, because free will is deluding yourself. Now, an interesting consequence of this is that whenever you think about things, like I think about this book, I can visualize it in my head and have a conscious thought about this book, and that's called intentionality. So I have my brain, and I think about an object, and it can even be something that I can't physically picture. Something like, somewhere I've never been, like Paris, right? I can think about that, right? I can think about an object here. But no lump of matter has any intentionality towards any other lump of matter. No molecule ever thinks about any other molecule. So you have to remember that any thoughts you have about things are not real, because you remember you're not thinking to begin with, and you have no intentionality. So whenever you think about a loved one, or you think about driving a car, or you think about eating food, or any kind of static object, no molecule thinks about any other molecule. They just react with each other. It's like you're a very, very complicated tree. You just have more circuits for which the inputs and outputs can follow. According to an atheist, the only solution to make your life a little bit better is to take Prozac or to take drugs. Literally, they will say this, I'll get on this later, to change these pathways so that the inputs produce maybe a slightly different output. But if you've been paying attention to this entire presentation, you cannot have any thoughts about anything. But the unfortunate conclusion is that also involves having thoughts about not having thoughts. And it's a very sticky problem. That's why he laughed in the beginning with Christopher Hitchens, because they're well aware of this problem. If you cannot have any intentionality, you're just very complicated molecules. It's like you're just a wet robot, basically, that's kind of like taught itself to think, and you've had lots of inputs and outputs, and you're very, very complicated. But remember, everything that's complicated can be brought back down to its previous brain states, and it can take a slice of time and say, this was your brain state, this is your brain state a second later. We can piece all these together, and we can see what inputs you had and what outputs you have, and we can map your entire life. The interesting problem is, in this brain state right here, this is in the past, right? At this brain state, you might have started to sing or say a sentence. But this person in this brain state is a different person because your molecules are different, and all you are molecules. So it's an interesting problem because why would you believe anything that you say? You don't have any intentional thoughts about anything. You definitely don't have any free will. You don't have any conscious mind. It's all an illusion. But somewhere in here, there's a very interesting problem because they realize that if you can't trust any thoughts from your brain about anything, you also can't trust any thoughts about not having thoughts. The most natural state your brain should be in is not thinking anything. But you also can't think about not thinking anything. So it's like this weird problem. You should be like this Buddhist monk that sits, in front of the mirror in the Shaolin temple and just doesn't, your mind is completely empty. But just don't ever think about having an empty mind, because then you're deluding yourself. And the problem is, there's a book that came out called... No, how do I get to the next screen?
Go back to
Here we go. The Atheist's Guide to Reality by Alex Rosenberg. In this book, he states exactly what I have just laid out right here, but an entire book. He says, there of course is no God, but there's also no free will. There are no moral values or obligations. There is no meaning to you. There's no meaning to the universe. And of course, good and evil do not exist. But the interesting problem is that he recognizes this self-refuting problem and kind of laughs it off. He says, of course, I shouldn't be telling you in this book about how to not think because you're not thinking at all anyway. So I definitely can't tell you how not to think because you're not thinking. So all he says is you should put this book down and go take Prozac if you feel bad about it. He says the only reason that you would ever do anything moral, of moral values or obligations, is to make your current brain state release a chemical that will make you feel slightly better, and your molecules will be in a slightly different arrangement, and maybe you'll get some dopamine and you will have this sensation. When you kill something, you might have this weird chemical sensation that makes you feel bad, so you don't do that thing. Does anyone see the inherent problem with this? Like when you ask atheists, if you are an atheist, you must come to this conclusion in the end. It is inevitable that pure nihilism, that nothing has any meaning. Because a table doesn't have any more meaning than a chair. And you definitely don't have any more meaning than any of those things. Francis Schaeffer talks about the interesting problem where if God exists, even the atheist has to live in God's world. And so there are truths that make this very uncomfortable. There's a disconnect here. They realize this problem, that they can't have any thoughts about anything, and that includes having this thought about anything about atheism. But they know that somewhere in there they do have a conscious mind, and they do exercise free will. So it's this really weird gray area where they know, I must believe this, but I can't. Because if you believe that you had no free will, it's like, how did you have the free will to believe you had no free will? If you're just determined by previous brain states over which you have no power, you don't have any power over your future ones either. The only thing you do is take drugs or hit yourself in the head or somehow change the molecule arrangements to make yourself feel something slightly different, have a slightly different output. And it's an interesting problem because when you look at it, the only solution to this self-refuting problem they have is they say, it really doesn't matter because the illusion is so strong, I just go with it. Like Sam Harris is very open about this. He says, I know that it's all an illusion. I know I have no thoughts. I have no free will. I don't love anyone. I don't have any moral obligations. I don't believe anything. I definitely can't trust anything that I think, except all of this. But he says that's okay because that's just how it is. And it's really a problem because a lot of atheists must exempt themselves. A lot of them say that consciousness doesn't exist except mine. Because a lot of them are uncomfortable to go that final step and say, all your consciousness don't exist, but I have a consciousness that knows that none of your consciousness exists. Morality doesn't exist, but don't do anything wrong to me because that is morally wrong against me. It's the problem where they exempt themselves because no one can live purely nihilistically. If somebody said to you, I believe in, I'm an atheist and I've taken it to its logical conclusion, I know that I'm determined and nothing has any meaning, you could literally just hold a pot of boiling water over their head and say, nothing has any meaning? And if they were true to their philosophy, they don't have any control over what they think about you pouring boiling water on their head. They might have a reaction to it. But it's just a brain state. You're just molecules. You shouldn't care if your molecules are burned or unburned. They're just molecules. No molecule cares about another molecule. You can have a lot of them arranged very complicated, or you can have just two, but they're no different. Yes?
Can they argue that, well, I would care because evolution, I don't know the word, but because of evolution, I'm going to care.
Yes, they could argue, well, maybe I've been burned in the past, and I know that the input of being burned does not have a desirable output because it releases the chemical that makes me feel pain and it hurts, so don't do it. But they can never argue to you that it's not right to do it. There is no right and wrong. There just is, right? Your molecules are not many more in a better state, vaporized all over the floor than they are in your current human form, right? You can't say your molecules are special and these chairs' molecules are not special. So yes, they could say, or they could fight you, because in their current brain state, they have the chemical reaction to know this will not feel good, right? But the problem is, if you really push them, what does this mean? Hitler wasn't wrong. Child rapists aren't wrong. Pedophiles aren't wrong. The pedophiles' molecules aren't any different than your molecules. They're just in a different brain state. But remember, those brain states, let's say in a child molester, somewhere in here, something went wrong. But you can't hold them accountable for it because they have no control over their previous brain states, which opens all kinds of weird moral questions about justice. Do we hold anyone accountable for anything? Because you could say, well, yeah, I killed somebody, but it was my previous brain state. It's because way back here in this brain state, right here, I had child abuse, or something like that. Or I saw somebody murder someone else. So my brain state here now influences this one here, and I just killed somebody. It's if you push them down to it, there must be no meaning to anything. C.S. Lewis says, atheism turns out to be too simple. If the whole universe has no meaning, we should never have found out that it has no meaning. A tree does not know that it's a tree. It's just a tree. It just is, right? If atheism is true and you are just a product of your previous brain states and you are just molecules, you should never have come to the conclusion that you are just molecules. It's the idea of, does a rock think about being rolled around as a rock? No, it just does. It just is. And you always have to remember that you are just you also. You are no better and no different than a rock. You're just more complicated. I mean, these are the popular atheists. This is the new wave of atheism. And they take pride in the fact that they have finally embraced the final step. Because atheists knew since the beginning of atheism that there was a final step, and they must inherently take it if they're to follow their worldview all the way through. But this problem right here really causes a lot of issues. Now, to me, the interesting part is, even as a worldview as a whole, if it is inherently self-refuting, that means it must not be true. And I would challenge you on this to see an argument or to find an argument that refutes this, that doesn't make this link somehow. Yes, Jim?
I'd like to address the free will thing for a minute versus just everything is a matter of reaction and electrochemical responses in our mind. First of all, if they're intellectually honest and they truly buy evolution in terms of macro evolution, then why did beings evolve to a state of being able to introspect? That is not just a reaction. Secondly, let's say I'm out here on the sidewalk, I'm laying down on my back, and you've got that boiling can of hot water. Now, if you go with Dawkins, and there's something I also want to point out about what he said. I just see something else on this. If you want to go with Dawkins, then the fact that you rolled out of the way before the guy actually dumped the water on you is survival instinct.
Oh, yeah.
That somebody figured out way back when that boiling hot water tends to hurt you. So we pass that down, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I can buy that. But if I'm out here on the sidewalk, what determines if I roll to the right or to the left? Survival instinct, evolution, nothing is going to tell me that I roll to the right or the left, and either way is going to save my life. So what am I going to do? What am I going to do only exists in probability until I do it, until I make a decision.
I don't think you can say make a decision, because you're not making a decision. You're relying on an antecedent past brain state. So your past brain state kind of made a decision. Because I would say, well, if you could roll to the left or the right, depending on what your previous brain state happened to be when that decision and that channel for the neurons to go through in the electricity, it's like, well, maybe there's an evolutionary idea of why you rolled.
I think if you go back and listen, I think he's talking about maybe past brain states in terms of the evolution of the brain.
Yes.
But as far as which direction you go in, there's nothing that's taught you to necessarily roll right or left.
You kind of materialist view that, so you're right-handed, your muscles on the right side of your body are going to be stronger, so you're naturally going to go to that side.
Okay, let's take your arms off.
Well, you still have that brain state from when you were right-handed.
Well, let's say you weren't born with it.
Well, then it'd be pure probability. You'd probably say 50-50 chance. Or maybe the ground was a little
You have
bit...
to make a decision. At some point, you can't escape a decision.
Yes, but is that decision something you rationally... That's the point. They would say, yes, you have the...
Now, are you making the argument as the atheist?
Yes. Because there's no, if you follow this worldview where there is no supernatural, there is materials only. Yes, you come to a point where you make the decision, but what influences you to make this decision, you would have to go back to the MRI and look at this previous brain state and be like, right here at this brain state, this frame, there was something that influenced something. If we got to the point where we could be that complicated to look at it. But a materialist, like Dawkins would argue, yes, it appears, it's like the grand illusion. Daniel Dennett says it's like a magic show. He's like, a magic show is not really witchcraft. It's just very impressive tricks. And he's like, your brain is just like that. It's just very impressive tricks. And the more and more we learn about the tricks, the more we can examine them and go down to a more reductionist, materialist view. But what you mentioned about
But the problem with Freud, which the gentleman said about the arm thing here, as far as maybe your right arm. If you go with that argument, then you have to concede that only uninformed decisions would be good decisions. A person can learn through experience. That's how we develop muscle memory. Experience. That's learning. Well, therefore, perhaps I've made an informed decision, but I've made a decision that will best.
So I guess with John, maybe we should, I think Jonathan would argue against the use of decision in the sense of there is no agency on an atheistic viewpoint.
Oh, I'm not arguing for them.
Sure.
Yeah.
But I.
Okay, so we all agree with you.
Yeah.
I agree with you, but the problem is,
I'm just suggesting some things that
Sure.
And there are other things. I mean, I just came into most of it, but I mean, there's some other arguments that you can equip
Sure.
people with to defend free choice. But I mean, that's one of the most simple things. And
I agree with you.
the fact of the matter is, most Christians will not come up against him. They'll come up just against in their daily life, and that's a start. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And then you can go to more complex arguments for free choice later.
Oh yeah, I agree. I agree with you. But the point I'm getting at is the most freeing thing, as we went over earlier, is if you find something that is necessarily false, where I should never have thoughts about anything being false or any of those things. I must extinguish all thoughts, including the thought about not having all thoughts, and the thought about that thought. They all must be extinguished because they're all not real. If you get to the point where a worldview is inherently self-refuting, it must be false. And to me, it's the most freeing thing in the world because you look back and you're like, I have a starting point. I can X off materialism because at its very core tenets, it is self-refuting. Now, a whole other side thing could be going to, talking about the very real arguments of, why, other reasons why this is not true. But I think just at the very, because atheists want to inform. They want to be more publicly, they're very open about things now that they used to not be.
Did you notice what he did, though? When Dawkins answered his answer, when he responded, he did two things that could disarm an opponent. One, he used humor.
Mm-hmm.
And two, he conceded a point. This is something that I struggle with. And I think too often that Christians were so, when we do have muster up the nerve to really defend ourselves, we don't play it smart like that.
Yeah.
Sometimes we come across too stridently. But I thought that was very clever that he does that. He did that on purpose.
Oh yeah.
Humor and conceding a point before he went on and said what he did.
Exactly. And then the point you can bring back is then every other statement after he said, well, my mind is not necessarily made up. And then he makes all of these assertions or an argument after that. And you could say, how on earth did you get to that argument? And he would have to say, well, I didn't really get to it. It just is.
His mind is not made up, but it is made up.
Yes. There is no other explanation. Corinne, you had some point?
I was just going to say something about his, which way would you roll? Because there's, in one of our science classes, we were looking at flatworms, which are considered, very primal type of organism, and they statistically will roll one way or the other way, depending on the individual organism.
Mm-hmm.
And scientists don't really know why, but they're kind of assert that they're more left-handed or right-handed, even though they obviously don't have any limbs. They're like a flatworm. So in that sense, somebody could argue and say, well, just because nobody says, well, the flatworm thinks,
Yeah.
it said it should roll left or right, but continually when you test it, it's statistically significant.
For sure.
It will roll one way or the other.
Well, like Daniel Dennett and Sam Harris especially will say that the greatest trick the mind has ever played is giving you the idea that you can have thoughts about your own brain or thoughts about thoughts. No thoughts are true, as we remember. They just exist, right? But to think back, like if you think abstractly, you ever think a tree thinks about being a tree. But humans, we think about being a human. They say it's the greatest trick. Because from that, we had this idea that, oh, we're special and there's, this higher thinking or something like that. The most they ever get to is that it's tricks and we're going to get there. It's how it all ends. They say, because you forget that they are using a bag of tricks to tell you about a bag of tricks. They can't, unless they exempt themselves, they can't step out of the situation. And it's really hard because it's hard to be out of a self-refuting situation when you're very much in that situation. Something to remember that I think is very interesting is that this whole situation is not geared for truth, it's geared for survivability. There is no truth inherent in this, and there's no falsity. When you look at this from a very materialistic perspective, they would say, your brain evolving to the current state it is geared just to survive. It's not geared to find anything that's true. Because inherently, there really is no gradients of truth or false or good or bad or any of these things. There just is existence. So it's hard to look at it and say, how could you ever know that how could you ever know that it's true that your brain is not geared to find truth? It's like wherever you go, it's like he uses an example of the book, he's like when you whack a mole, another one pops up. Because self-refuting statements, when they are encapsulated, when a lot of them are encapsulated in a worldview, you can stamp one out and another one comes up because you remember that you're always stuck within this worldview. You're always stuck within this brain state to say that I only have brain states. And that's where I talk about the idea Francis Schaeffer says where you are stuck in God's world and there's this tension. He calls it the point of tension, where you realize that something just doesn't add up. And when I've talked to atheists in the past, they say, yes, I agree with everything, but just something doesn't feel right. There are moral obligations. There are free thoughts and actions. I do have free will. I do think about things rationally. I can find truth values. So there's this weird disconnect. I can think about my own mind. So it's very hard because on one hand, they must hold to a hard, deluding myself, materialist worldview, but on the other hand, they can't because if they did, they would either go insane or they'd have to quit somewhere.
Would you say that maybe our goal should be to understand this rationale and get to this part of the conversation with any atheist that's willing to have a good conversation? Because what you're saying is they are the most prominent new wave atheists are aware of this problem, and the best they got is
It's a magic show.
roll with it.
Mm-hmm. It's just how it is. We have to roll with
So
it.
if that's the best they got, and you got somebody who claims to be an atheist, it sounds like this should be the goal to get to this point.
Yes, well, they must come to that point because you say these are the most well-learned, vocal, forefront atheists. A really important point that is a good takeaway from this is a lot of people pull this trick. They say, as an atheist, I just lack the belief in God, which is not true. An atheist says there is no God. Because if somebody says to you, I lack a belief in God, they haven't said anything about truth. They said something about their psychology. You should immediately say to them, that's nice. Thank you for informing me of your opinion. Why should I listen to you? Because if they say, I lack a belief, that doesn't say anything about it being truth. I could say, I lack a belief in elephants, but that has no bearing on whether or not elephants actually exist. But if I say there are no elephants, that is making a statement about their existence. Atheists, a lot of times, it's a really quick little trick, like you were talking about humor and stuff. They say, well, you know what? You believe in God, and I just lack a belief in God, and I'm, obviously more informed than you. And then, it's like, if you concede that point, you've automatically let them away with all these things. Atheism, by definition, is saying that the belief that there is no God at all. It is a good point because if an atheist is well read enough, it is absolutely inevitable that they must end up at this. There is no other option. And if you can get to them to the point, this is the next thing that Cowles talks about. This is the last thing we'll touch on tonight, is this idea of test driving. Live in someone else's worldview. When someone is talking to you and they say a statement like, all morals are relative, adopt that worldview and jump in the car and sit behind the driver's seat and is like, well, where are we going to end up? Adopt their statements and worldview and try to understand where you end up by following their instructions faithfully. If you arrive at an odd, unexpected, or illogical destination, point it out. Something like Hitler was totally fine. Or Jeffrey Dahmer was totally fine to rape those women. Or any of those things. You should probably be like, this is kind of a weird place to end up. Sometimes when you press an idea to its logical conclusion, the result is counterintuitive or absurd. Some arguments prove too much. They go too far, like this. Those who are not realists are either dead or in an institution. And that's something we have to remember. If somebody says, oh, I don't believe this, if they're trying to step out of realism, either they're dead or they've fried their brains on drugs and they're probably in an institution or they're going to soon be in an institution. Because none of you are non-realists. You all live with a rationale. So you have that as a starting point. Now I picked these specifically because they're polarizing examples, maybe. And look at the logic. If you don't agree with the logic, be something we can discuss. But you reduce the person's viewpoint to its basic argument. What is their specific claim? When they say all morals are relative, what are they actually getting at? Anything that comes naturally is also moral and permissible. Homosexuality comes naturally to some people, therefore homosexuality is moral and acceptable. Has anyone heard a version of this argument? Okay. A possible test drive of this argument would be to say anything that comes naturally is also moral and permissible. If a gay-hating/attacking gene is isolated, this would be a natural trait for some people. Since this comes naturally, then this is moral and acceptable. The idea is, should we resist this or accept it? Did this come to a weird conclusion? Living according to natural state would incite all kinds of animal barbarism. Civilization is the difference between doing what comes naturally and principled self-restraint. If it holds for one, does it hold for the other one? And it's interesting because even with smaller claims, if you jump in the driver's seat and you say, that's a great point you made. Let's see what its logical conclusion is. If its logical conclusion is something like Hitler did nothing wrong, or it's totally okay to attack gays because that's natural, you might think, because you're using what they just stated, you're using their own car to drive off a cliff, basically. Children deserve quality of life. We should abort a baby to save it from future child abuse/disabilities and the hardship this entails. This is my right. Has anyone heard an argument like this? A child is born of incest, or they're going to be in an abusive situation. It is better for the child. Children deserve quality of life. We should kill a 2-year-old to save it from future child abuse/disabilities and the hardship these entail. This is my right. Does an 8-inch travel magically infer personhood? It may not necessarily follow, these arguments may not necessarily follow, but it's the idea of jumping on board and saying, like this, does an 8-inch journey transform tissue into a human being? Does life begin when the first breath is taken? Can I take someone off life support if they're not breathing? What if they start to breathe in the future? Does life begin when the heart beats? Can I take someone off life support who has no heartbeat? What if they end up surviving? It's the idea that I've heard a lot of these things, well, life begins when the first breath is taken. Well, what if I'm in a coma and I'm being artificially ventilated and I come out of the coma, but as soon as I'm not breathing, I have no life, because life is determined by breathing. It's something where if you can take their viewpoint, it definitely takes some practice, but if you apply it, like he uses in the book the thing to say, I personally would not kill my baby, but it's okay for other people to kill their babies, and you can jump on that and say, well, you can follow all these viewpoints. You might not necessarily arrive in a really, really weird situation, but if you do, it begs the question, should we resist this or accept it? I was having a conversation with an atheist the other day, and we came to the point where he said to me, Hitler did nothing wrong. And I just kind of sat there and was like, what do you think about that? And he's like, yeah, it's kind of weird. It's kind of like this point of wow, where have I gotten to? Where is the logical conclusion of this?
What did you ask him? How did he reach that conclusion?
Oh, well, he said, there's no, cultures have different morals. And what was culturally right back then wasn't necessarily culturally right today. And we have different cultural values. And therefore, it's not for me to say that their culture's values were any better than my own. They were just different, and I wasn't alive then, but Hitler was. Basically, it came down to the idea of just power. That he was in control, and he kind of made the rules, and, it was okay back then. So then it gets into like slavery, and it gets into like Stalin or any of these sticky questions where you're like, can you actually not say that this was morally wrong to exterminate 63 million Russians and Eastern Europeans, you know? Because it's the example of test driving. You take it to its final conclusion and say, does this follow? I did watch an interesting thing about morality that, you can take it down to the personal level, and you can say, well, different people have different morals, and I can't necessarily say, like, we agree on the language we're using, but you have different moral claims than I do. So then you could pull up to the cultural level and say, well, one culture here in this part of the world has their morals, and one culture here has these morals. But the problem is you can never escape that thing of saying, is there any comparison between these? I don't know. You can't escape the problem. Does anyone have any questions or want to go back up over anything?
I've got a comment on what you were saying with the different cultures. There's another problem that which culture, how did you determine that this culture and that culture? Or you can say, well, it's just whatever culture you live in. But what culture do you live in? Because most people live in multiple cultures. Whether you're talking about state level, are you from Colorado, or are you from the U.S.? Are you, you can talk about what race you belong to, different things like that. So what do you identify your culture, and under what stance do you claim that culture?
And where do you define it? Where do you draw the line?
Another thing I bring up when you're talking about just the consciousness and decision-making and how everything's determined with an atheist, then they have no grounding to stand on for any of the things that they use to argue for their beliefs.
Oh, yeah.
They can't really say that there's any proof of evolution because they can't ground thought itself. And so it rips the whole thing apart.
Or any scientific thought, yeah.
I mean, have you seen, to me that's so odd to see Richard Dawkins kind of admitting that.
It created quite a stir.
Kind of see,
it's a joke. It's a big joke. They see it, but it's just a joke. That's why he laughed about the Christopher Hitchens, because Christopher Hitchens was one of the first to make a joke about this. Well, I have no choice. Do you have free will? Well, I have no choice. Kind of an idea. It is something where you can definitely come back to and say, you trust everything in science, but you have no basis for rational thought, and science relies on rational thought and repeatability and logic.
you had no choice but to believe in evolution.
I think what Dawkins would come back and talk about, having read several of the stuff, I think his argument there is that there is no choice, that he is so invested in evolution, that evolution is simply an emerging observation, and a better understanding of what we're of the evidence.
Right. So that gives him no better grounding than me, who's also come to my belief in God for the exact same reasons, really, in the end.
No, I agree with you completely. But I'm just saying, he wouldn't come at, I don't think, evolution from. I didn't know if you were arguing it from choice, because I don't think he would argue evolution from choice. I think he would argue evolution from simply observation. There's never any choice in it.
Right.
Yeah.
But yeah, if everything's determined, you're not really
Look, there it is.
yeah.
It's a really uncomfortable thought to think that you are just a bunch of atoms. Really, it's a bunch of quantum bosons and fermions or whatever, and you really are just a collection of those. You're just in a little bit more of a complicated collection. One last thought I'll leave you guys with. This is something interesting. It's like a thought experiment. The law of non-contradiction states that something can't also be at the same time not something else. You can't have something be true and false at the same time. It's what we've been talking about this entire night, right? So the idea that the laws of logic, the basic laws of logic, like the laws of non-contradiction, are from a mind, right? If you remember that diagram, here's us, right? And here's molecules. And here's the mind of God. Morality, consciousness. I don't know how to spell consciousness. But if your handwriting's bad enough, no one can tell. Morality, consciousness, the idea of the soul, the mind, and logic itself comes from a mind because it is immaterial. The laws of logic, you can't go find them in a tool shed somewhere. You can't have 100 grams of logic, right? It is an immaterial property. But the interesting thought is, if man started here, right, and man has existed until here, is it true that before man existed, man did not exist? And the idea is to get at the point that the laws of logic still held true, because an atheist will tell you the laws of logic were discovered by mankind. It's something that just made sense and we discovered it, right? But the interesting thing is, before any mankind or any atheist existed, or any conscious mind, is it true that no conscious mind existed? The idea that the laws of logic held as descriptive, and well, they'd say, well, they're just descriptive. They describe how nature is. But the problem is they're descriptive and prescriptive. They're telling you what you should think. So it's definitely, I don't know. It's a thought experiment, because it's the idea that if a mind exists as the first preeminent mind, and our minds right here can comprehend all of these things, right? Which we know on a day-to-day basis. Atheists have a very hard time to deny this. Then it comes to the point where you have to think, did the laws of logic, or any law like the laws of physics, any of these other things, exist before I was ever around to see them? Or is it something that I just discovered? Anyway.
They're saying that we just discovered it? 'Cause I've never heard any atheist friend of mine say that.
It's
that we've created logic.
We've either created it or discovered it. There was no... we've created it. That there's no... create is the right word I'm looking for. At this point, from existence, we have created things to make the world make sense. And those include the 3 fundamental laws of logic, the laws of physics, any other natural law, right? But they say that they're very firmly seated in naturalistic materialism. They are just a physical property, right? But the interesting thing is, okay, if they're a physical property, if you can immediately prove that they, for instance, even before man, before anything material was around, or anything natural was around, say at this point, there is nothing natural. There's no universe before this. Is it true that there was no universe? Because then the law of logic would have to hold before there was anything around to discover or create the laws of logic or any other law. Or is it true that there were no laws of physics? It's a thought. I don't know. That's all I got. If anyone has any questions, I think we're done here. Thanks. Yeah. Dear Lord, thank you for this time, and thank you that we can gather here and be rational and use our rational minds that you've given us, Father, that we can tell truth from false, and we can strive after you and learn more about you and the truth of your universe. I pray that you would just give us all a good rest of the week and keep us safe and bring us back here next Tuesday. Amen.